Great.
And just basically, there's nothing off the table. You just let me know what's on your mind.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. And so I've done a little bit of reading on what you're up to. Probably not exhaustive, but as much as I can. And so what I want to ask you is maybe for your elevator pitch and how you talk about the hum to folks who are asking you. And for instance, if you're at a cocktail party or something, and somebody says, "Well, what do you do for a hobby or something?" How do you describe the hum?
Well, I would, I would question the word hobby, but um, as to the thrust of your question, this was something that I stumbled over and into, and it's the classic story that I've told many times, but in a nutshell, in spring of 2012, I became aware in the late evening, early nighttime, of a most unusual sound, which at first I thought just were float planes flying overhead, or because we have a lot of that here in this part of the world. And then the one evening that I thought that I should actually step outside and see what all this is about, when I stepped outside, the sound stopped. And well, of course, that piqued my interest immediately. And then I went about a series of investigations leading right up to cutting the power to the entire house. Naturally, I thought maybe there was a fridge malfunctioning or something. So when I did that, the hum became even louder. The noise became louder. Then I started, walking around the neighborhood and not hearing it outdoors, and led me to getting in my car. And with the windows rolled up and the engine off, I could hear it. So that led to the obvious experiment of driving around, and everywhere I went, I could hear it. Then I did what most people end up doing. And in fact, the vast majority of people who end up learning about the hum through my site do what I did, which is to go to the internet and type in, something along the lines of unusual low frequency humming noise, something like that. And that led to descriptions of the phenomena. And in the middle of and awash in all the conspiracy and outright lunacy that's been associated with the topic, there were several serious discussions and papers, which very quickly led me to conclude that there was a need now to develop a serious forum for discussion of the phenomena and for research into it. And that led to my project and led to a surprisingly wide exposure and hopefully normalization of the topic.
And that's what I understand you've really been setting out to do over the past couple of years, is really trying to normalize it. And why I'm sure you're here as well is trying to get the word out, and to almost, it seems like, to let people know that to let people know they're not crazy, and also to show people that these people are not crazy. And I've seen you use the comparison of this to tinnitus, saying, like, how do you know tinnitus exists? And how can you tell somebody that they're not hearing a particular noise?
The comparison to tinnitus tends to be a powerful one.
Mhm.
It tends to, it's a bit of a logic trap that I use for the incredulous, but at the same time, that discussion leads to the realization, like it or not, that reality itself very much has a democratic element to it. Well, I mean, for example, like the example I've used is that if somebody tells you or tells me that they see purple rats running up and down the wall, my reaction is, I believe that you see that, but I don't believe that we can set up any sort of scenario that can externally validate that,
Mhm.
and which is a polite way of saying, no, that's a hallucination.
Right.
And with regard to the part about people not being crazy, there's actually a very simple fact that rules out at least mass hysteria. And that is, the vast majority of the people who discover my work do so independently through their own searching, and not because they heard it from somebody else.
Yeah.
And the fact that the experiences are so similar across the board. So no, in fact, it's one of the few things that keeps me going, is the fact that people describe the massive emotional relief that comes from finding out that this is in fact a well-documented phenomenon.
If I could add to your repertoire of logic traps, I was trying to think of a comparison. Out here in the eastern U.S., we have Lyme disease, which for a while was a public health threat that wasn't really recognized. It was generally misdiagnosed, but more recently has been the anosmia, I think they call it, with COVID-19, or paranosmia. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce it. It's one of those things you've only seen written, but losing your sense of smell or smelling is basically a false smell, which I know people who are suffering from, and they've done the same thing in this case of the hum that people are doing, which is going out and seeking out information and finding essentially support groups of other sufferers, and it's been a huge relief for people. It sounds like, and just reading your database and going through, I just scrolled through many entries and spent some time reading people talking about it. It's a very difficult thing for people to get across, and many of the descriptions are so reaching. There's just a multitude of descriptions about what this sounds like, and then we can sort of get into what your leading explanation is at the moment, but many different frequencies, but there are some frequencies that can be ruled out, and you've done so much work to help people rule out, say, an air conditioner unit gone haywire. And I've seen Henrik's work, who is on your team, who has created several guides that have helped people basically screen out the nonsense from what would be the real hum, essentially.
Yeah, now Heinrich, who is based in Scandinavia, he has made some profound contributions in that regard. And the reason why that his work was so necessary was because that many standard anthropogenic sounds, ranging, well, you mentioned, I think maybe one or two of them, but transformers and heat pumps and so many things have similar characteristics to the world hum. And so he's developed a method for teasing out and separating those two things. And in fact, it's turned out to be a significant part of the project, because of all the people who report to the database, I end up throwing out well more than half the reports.
Wow.
And it's not, and I certainly believe the people who are making noise complaints, unfortunately, it's not what I'm studying. It turns out it's become part of the package of what I present on the website, just because it's so useful. And not only can it determine whether you're hearing the world hum or not, it can actually give specific tools and advice for pinpointing exactly what and where what the sources are of other sounds that people might be hearing.
Did you think that you would be having that kind of impact in people's lives when you took up this project?
Oh my goodness, no. I take pains to point out to everybody who interviews me that I'm not a scientist. However, I know a little bit about everything. And, I'm looking at the bookshelf behind you, for example, and it looks like you are cut from the same cloth. However, not only do I have that sort of general knowledge, but I've actually taught, in some cases up to the college level, at least about 7 or 8 different subjects. So it puts me in a position to know just enough to be dangerous, as they say. But it gives me to know just enough to ask the right questions and to go find people who can answer the types of questions that I'm asking. And so, yeah, I mean, it has put me into a rather unusual position. And that is, I have willingly essentially sacrificed my privacy to the extent that, especially, I am somewhat infamous in this small little town, where everywhere I go, including with my own students, people know exactly what it is that I do on the side on that project and all the major media that I've appeared in. And so I've become the public face of this phenomenon. But the difference between the work that I'm doing and the work, let's say, of Dr. David Deming, or the work of, let's say, Jeff Leventhal and those people, is that mine is the first in the internet era. And as a result, we now have the tools and the means to generate a critical mass to ultimately get a serious laboratory or university involved where we can they can conduct the experiments that I've already suggested, but I simply, I don't have access to the equipment. So yeah, and when that's all done, then I can retreat back to my previous life and get on with it.
And how long has it been? So you said 2012 is
9 years.
when you started experiencing, and then you started the project itself when?
The first iteration of the hum map was essentially in December of that year of 2012. So we are coming up on 9 years now. And I think that even though I have made some scientific progress, my main goal has been advocacy and normalization. And one thing I'd like to jokingly point out is that as much as the media has used me, I've used them. And some people have criticized me for adopting the phrase "the worldwide hum," saying that it intentionally creates an air of mystique and conflates it with more ridiculous things. But it turns out that was intentional, because one of the roots to the normalization is, first of all, to make people simply aware of it. And then for those who are serious, then I can engage them on a serious level about it. So there's been some deliberate media strategy here. So I've tried to reach as many people as I could. And I think that's one part of the project that's been reasonably successful.
On this podcast, we do a little bit of, I don't know if you want to call it media criticism, but have you found yourself hitting any resistance or things like that, coming up against any walls?
Yes, very much so. And I can actually name names. And I'm famous for that.
Yeah.
Probably the worst has been Yahoo. Now, with one major exception, Yahoo UK did an excellent piece. But however, some of the other Yahoo pieces have been a disaster.
Wow.
Here's what tends to happen. And I'm not suggesting any conspiracy on this, but what's interesting that 2 or 3 times per year, almost like clockwork, there is research that's reported that claims to have solved the hum. And then when you dig in, you'll see they've done nothing of the sort. And it turns out that it's not a conspiracy. It's simply that the quality of science reporting is so poor that the so-called science reporters don't even have a basic grasp of some of the most elementary, like high school level topics in physics and frequency and wavelength. And in some cases, the problems are in translation. There was some really widely reported French research coming out of 2017 and 2018, which was widely reported, and I made quite a bit of noise about it, that in fact, that their research was fascinating, but had absolutely nothing to do with what I'm studying. And so the real damage done by that is that serious people will look at the headlines only and say, okay, well, they've got to the bottom of that one. Now we'll move on to, Meghan Markle or something, or whatever is catching people's attention, whatever other trivia is catching people's attention that day. So, there's been that. Colin Dickey's piece in the New Republic was interesting. My only regret there was that Steve Kohlhaas, whatever his name is, his work was, if we can call it that, was conflated with mine. I wish that the two of us hadn't been mentioned in the same article, but so be it. And I would also say that amongst the whole media experience, ranging from Al Jazeera sending a documentary crew out to NHK from Japan, even Coast to Coast, which was an excellent experience, by the way. All of that was great, but there's only one that I regret. And that's the Inside Edition. And they came up for 6 hours and we filmed in 3 different locations. And I ended up getting about 90 seconds squeezed in between the mental illness crowd and the apocalypse folks. And it's the one that my students have all seen, the one with 6.5 million views. Now, if only I could monetize that one. It was on somebody else's channel. And it's quite notorious, again, in my part of the world, again, with all the massive number of views. And I don't think I did the project too many favors with that one. But overall, the experience has been good because I have ended up taking, and for people who know my work, I take actually a very conservative and fairly strict scientific approach to things, which is the only reason the project has survived.
Yeah.
And I simply wear down, the people who would like to attach this phenomenon to, more ridiculous things.
That's one of the things I've admired about looking at the project. Like me looking at it now, I was sort of familiar with the phenomenon, and then dropped out of my consciousness. I don't suffer from it, and I don't know anybody who tells me that they do. But when I jumped back into it, I was able to take a retrospective on your work and see it over the past few years. And one of the things I noticed is that you, and I think it's very admirable, is that you have gone through the various explanations and possible reasons for this occurring and for this phenomenon, and you've knocked them out to the extent that you can. And it doesn't seem like you've become attached to them, and which is what science is. You're looking for the explanation. And I feel like there's many people just looking at the comments that come into you and what's thrown at you in the media, and explanations just constantly thrown, is people get very attached to the idea that this is it must be 5G, it must be this or that. And so one of the great things about your project, and I wondered if you could reflect on this, is that you've put aside explanations that don't make sense and that can't be you can't reproduce them. You had experiments specifically having to do with low frequency radio or low frequency transmissions, things like that you have put aside. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that process and kind of keeping your emotions out of it.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, I think that to some extent, people misunderstand some of my reactions to their own speculations and theories.
Mhm.
So for example, we've got some folks who will make a claim that they have powerful evidence that the hum is caused by X, like whatever their theory is. And it turns out, I mean, in their particular cases, whatever X might be, could well indeed be causing a hum lowercase h. Absolutely. In fact, I could probably list right now off the top of my head 30 such sources. And they maybe resent the fact that I would give several pieces of evidence that explain why it's not a generic explanation. That is the generic worldwide phenomenon that I'm studying. So there's some very simple sets of questions that I can ask, or that can sort through that. With regard to your overarching question, Dr. David Deming's paper inspired me originally.
Yep.
And in fact, that's why I named my somewhat notorious Deming box experiment in his honor. Now, I will point out on this podcast, and to whoever asks, I have subsequently been made aware of some of Dr. Deming's positions on certain topics,
Okay.
which I reject out of hand.
Okay.
Whether it's climate change or with gun rights, all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I view that as an irrelevancy, and I don't view that his positions on other topics as being germane to his original speculations on the hum.
Mm-hmm.
He had excellent reason to believe at the time in 2004, when that paper was published, that military VLF transmissions were responsible. Yep. And it was quite a compelling case he made. I don't know if you read the paper or
I
not.
did. That was one of the first ones I read. Yeah.
It's a really nicely done paper.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it turns out that he was quite incorrect. And the reason why is because he didn't have the data that I have now.
Okay.
Like, and just a couple of quick examples.
Yeah.
There is no such thing as hum hotspots. It's simply not the case. Mm-hmm. Now, there are, if you take a look at the famous case, let's say of Kokomo, Indiana. Mm-hmm. Now, there, it turns out malfunctioning industrial equipment was responsible for the majority of those reports. In the Windsor situation, I'll call it the Windsor disturbance, it turns out it's overwhelmingly evident that American industrial activity over on Zug Island is responsible for what's happening. That's not at the lowercase h hum. So when Deming suggested VLF transmissions, he did what every researcher is supposed to do, and that is suggest future research. So standing as that famous phrase, and standing on the shoulder of giants, I picked up his idea and I went ahead with the part of it that I could.
Yeah.
It turns out even his experimental design was problematic. Like, for example, he suggested that one of the boxes would be an anechoic chamber, that is a soundproof chamber. Well, I don't know if you've ever been in a so-called soundproof or listen, there's no way that you can be inside one of those chambers and not know that you're in one.
Yep.
It's quite for any listener who's never been in one, I really encourage you go try that sometime and see what I mean. So I did the one that I could do, which is, of course, I created a small, and yes, unfortunately, it looked just like a coffin. And it was composed of, I think it was 18 gauge mild steel with a specially designed hatch and all that. And so I actually tested the VLF side of the theory. And for myself and the few other people who went inside, we found that the hum either was not attenuated at all, or it got louder.
Okay.
Yeah. And so that, in conjunction with numbers of other informal reports, leads us to believe that VLF radio transmissions are not the source, the immediate source of the worldwide hum. Now, some people have suggested ELF. I can't actually rule that out.
Okay.
ELF radio transmissions actually transit right through the globe and actually cannot be blocked. That's why the world's militaries use them for initial communication to the deep submarines. They'll send an ELF gong, so to speak, and then the submarines will ascend up to VLF antenna depth, and so on and so on.
Got it. Okay.
So basically, again, trying to stay focused on your question.
Yeah.
I then, having dispensed with the VLF electromagnetic theory, I then cast my net out and simply sat and conducted thought experiments and wondered about what sorts of experiments would, what sorts of hypotheses or theories could make sense given what we know or think we know. And then I came up with my reasonably well-known list of 4 theories, the first of which we've just discussed.
Yep.
And there's several things that are very troubling with regard to the hypotheses, and I think the one that I keep coming back to is the timeline. The timeline is crucial here. If we believe that the world hum first rose to prominence or awareness in the late 1960s to early 1970s, something must have happened during that period to cause this. And why in England? Why in Largs, Scotland? Why over in Bristol? And then why then, less than 10 years later to the United States, and so on and so on. And now apparently around the world, people can hear it well. There's several answers to that. The first is that it has been here all along. And so occasionally when I have a few hours, I'll go through my archives on the Times of London, all the way back to the early 1800s, and looking for evidence of the hum. And I found some rather striking things. If I wasn't full employed otherwise, there'd be several side questions I'd be fascinated to explore, such as why is it that every, let's say, 30 to 40 years in England, there was these massive spikes in hauntings and haunting stories and ghost stories. It's not static. It comes in like 30 to 40, 50-year cycles. And I'd be interested in that. I'd also be interested in learning more about the people who several times historically have reported the sound of a large swarm of bees. But you have to remember that the classic description of the hum is that it's the sound of a truck or a vehicle idling outside one's home. Well, I mean, people didn't have that language back in the early 1800s. Therefore, what language or metaphor did they use? So that's one thing that I've asked people several times to go look. And despite my public calls for sort of a coordinated, outsourced, public sourced research, very few people have taken me up on that.
Yeah.
With regard to the timeline, there's also the possibility that it's been, let's say, 20 to 30 years before it became, like, who knows?
Yeah.
If we take the current timeline, then one of the possibilities is that either a new technology was introduced around that time that is having some effect on people that way, or some either prescription or over-the-counter medication was introduced around that time, which incidentally is why we ask such questions on our survey now, such as prescription drug use. We know, for example, that there are some antibiotics that are autotoxic, that is OTO, autotoxic. Even some basic penicillins can be damaging to the hearing system. Simple aspirin, in some cases, can be toxic to the auditory system. So, question, is there a prescription drug or over-the-counter drug that became available in England and then became available in America? Now, there's people out there, pharmacologists perhaps, who could answer that question, but they're perhaps even less interested than I am in this question. And I only have so many hours in the day to devote to this. So having sat and thought about it, I came up with those three other theories. The one that we're pursuing right now is the fact that, like tinnitus, but arising from a quite different mechanism, we think that the hum is in fact internally generated, that it is a perception of sound and not a sound. I think the evidence that it's not a sound is overwhelming. And some people, don't really want to hear that, but pardon the pun, but just as a quick example, if I take highly sensitive recording equipment, you're in the business, and for those listeners who might know, I own a Zoom H4n Pro, which is an excellent professional quality portable recording gear. And I've taken it into various locations, and I've deployed it and come back with absolutely nothing. If you take several people who can hear the hum and put them in a room, they will perceive different frequencies. That never, ever happens with standard sounds. Like, for example, if I walk over to my piano over here, and if I strike, let's say, 3 octaves below middle C, and then get blindfolded people to walk up to the piano and match that note, they will all match the same note. That's because they're all hearing the same note.
Yep.
So there's evidence upon evidence that people who hear the hum are not hearing a standard acoustic sound. And so therefore it leads to the fact that it's either internally generated or perhaps something external, which is, for whatever reason, generating a different perceived frequency. And there are also other indicators that point to the internal source. I'd like to share one with you that not a lot of people know about. There's a thing called an autoacoustic emission, which can even be recorded in newborn babies. These are clicking sounds, or sounds that are generated internally. In fact, they even produce microphones that can be inserted into the inner ear that can record these emissions, which are very common. Now, what's quite remarkable is that people who suffer from, or just shouldn't say suffer, who can sense the world hum, almost every single last one of them will report that air travel will disrupt the hum for either 3 or 4 days. This is a fascinating result. And the reason why is because the precise same thing happens with autoacoustic emissions. A German researcher by the name of Frosch was first to report this. In fact, Frosch, that's F-R-O-S-C-H, his paper, which is not well known, is titled The Hum and Autoacoustic Emissions May Arise from the Same Source. And he did some interesting studies on people who detect hums. In German, the hum is known as the Brummton. And this is what motivated him to go study that. So we have that connection to autoacoustic emissions. We also have the rather unusual behavior of the hum. That is, if you are hearing the hum and there's a sudden loud masking noise, such as a loud exhalation or a shaking of the head, which is the one that Bernie Hutchins promotes. I simply find that sensation so uncomfortable. I don't do it myself.
Yeah.
But either that loud exhalation or shaking of the head will disrupt the hum for maybe 300 to 400 milliseconds.
Okay.
It actually short circuits the hum for up to half a second, and then it returns. But that doesn't happen with standard low frequency sounds. So it's actually diagnostic in that sense. All of these things taken together lead me to believe that this is something that the body is generating now. The only question is why and how? Could it be that the hum is subsequent to some other type of exposure? For example, if you know people who spend their day wearing headphones or spend their day on a jackhammer or exposed to loud noises, they are at a hugely increased risk for developing tinnitus later on. Those things don't cause the tinnitus directly immediately. Well, could it be that the hum is similar in the fact that some other thing, some other exposure causes a subsequent hum in these people? Well, that's interesting because when you look at the demographics of the hum, the mean and median age of hum here is about 40.5 years, 41 years of age, which in fact is the same as the population distribution for North America.
Okay.
And so there's counter evidence and also supporting evidence in that sense. And there's, again, trying to be disciplined and returning to your original question. It's this sort of cold and analytical approach that in fact has moved things forward. One of the hardest things for scientists to do, and you've already come right out and said it, is to look yourself in the mirror one morning and say, I've been wrong. That's, for example, what distinguishes science from religion, because that conclusion is not permissible in faith systems. And not meaning to distract or to initiate a fight with anybody, but
Sure.
it's a sharp distinction.
Yeah.
And the scientific community, by the way, works by consensus, contrary to what some people think. It's simply a consensus of experts and specialists in the field that determine scientific truth, if we can use that term. So it's that mindset that I was raised with, and that I live by, that caused me to look at the VLF theory, and all that time, several years, by the way, that I invested to finally arrive at my conclusion that that's simply not so. The VLF theory, I don't think, has any merit anymore. Now, if someone presents to me impressive evidence, then I'll reevaluate it. That's the mindset that I've approached, and I've just given you an example of some of the steps and side steps that I've taken and the questions that I've asked along the way. And it's where we are right now.
And it's interesting what you had mentioned way back when we were starting to talk about how you're a bit of a generalist, wide reader, somebody who has a curiosity about things, and that seems to have served you very well, because an acoustic scientist who's very invested in just acoustics may have dove in too far and then found that they hit the dead end and would need to shift their research program over. And so the fact that you've taken the generalist approach seems like it's really helped the project out.
When you give a person a hammer for a present, many things start looking like nails. And what I mean by that is, well, precisely what you said. If you take a specialist in any particular field, whether it's radio physics or acoustics or audiology or even seismology, that's the filter that they use to interpret what they see and experience and what data that they see. The image that I would like to give is that my scientific knowledge is a mile wide and an inch deep, whereas the specialists are an inch wide and a mile deep. And so that ability to connect, even including, by the way, psychology, and I'm a teacher of psychology, amongst other subjects, has been invaluable in, if again, nothing more than simply asking the right questions. And I do have people on my team who are actual scientists. but they would let me play to my strengths, which is interacting with the media and also helping teach the public. I am a teacher after all. And between the three of us, and I would identify three of us as being the main core here, we can address in a scientifically valid way all the things that we're grappling with here. I should be honest and say that, or at least transparent, and say that I had reached a point about 6 months ago where I even reached out to both of the other team members and I said to them in sort of a soul searching way, I really don't know what I should be doing now.
Yeah.
I mean, I've suggested all the experiments. And by the way, several of them would be so simple to conduct, but just simply no one has gone out and done them.
Mhm.
I can't go do them in some cases. And that everything from getting into an fMRI machine to descending to a mile below the earth in several mining locations. I mean, each of these would reveal important information. I've appeared, my project has appeared on most of the world's major media. We haven't cracked CNN or the Drudge Report yet, but I mean, I'm not that they are the gold standard for anything, but apart from that, and the advocacy that's ongoing, and the fact that clearly, tens of millions of people have at least been made aware of the topic, I I wasn't sure where to go, and I really think that apart from any ongoing advocacy that I do, what really has to happen is that one of these times there will be somebody listening to a podcast like this one, or even Inside Edition, or some of the things, some person with serious credentials
Yep.
associated with a lab, somebody will listen and go, oh, wait a minute, this is actually this actually is quite cool.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go get the answer to this, and never mind take the credit. But whatever. I mean, I think it would be awesome that the people who are actually suffering from this, like I don't suffer from this.
Mhm.
It's just a curiosity to me. But there's some people who suffer terribly from this. For them to finally get an answer, I think would be immensely gratifying to me, because sometimes the answer doesn't necessarily lead to amelioration of the problem, but it helps to know exactly what it is.
Yeah.
Even in tinnitus, like there really is no effective treatment for tinnitus, but it sure helps to know exactly what it is.
So I have another person that would really help out help
Yeah.
out if they were listening, which is I don't know if you've seen the movie Contact recently, the Jodie Foster, Carl Sagan movie, but there is a billionaire in that movie who just happens to take up her case. It would be great. I'm not great, but maybe great if there was a billionaire that was suffering from the hum who just happened to have some money to put aside to start a lab and throw into it. And the reason I I bring this up is that I've been in the business of research funding at institutions of higher education, and also funding small nonprofits for most of my career. So that's my day job outside of doing scientific, I guess, areas of scientific inquiry right now. That's my day job, is trying to find funding for people. And so I've worked with scientists who have had to do the same thing you're describing, where their research area dries up and they have to shift gears and figure out what they're going to do next. And it seems like it's well, I saw a joke once, and it said that the next step in the scientific method that is not there is seek funding, um, which I really loved. But that would be, if there was some way to do that, some way to get the word out there. Money doesn't hurt, is what I would say, for this type of thing.
Well, let me respond by saying first, I have seen the movie,
Yeah.
and look, if whether we take medical conditions such as lupus or prostate cancer or breast cancer, or whether we talk about mental illness such as bipolar, they all have their poster boys and girls. Charlie Sheen for bipolar. What is it for lupus? I think is it Selena Gomez, whoever it might be. So they all have their patrons, so to speak. And and they provide that visibility and in some cases funding. My contention would be that there almost certainly have been powerful, wealthy, and famous people who have heard the hum, but either haven't been aware of it or have been afraid to say so.
Yeah.
Now, the fear aspect, I think, should be greatly diminished now. I think it's been largely normalized, and I've tried to play a role in that. With regard to the awareness aspect, well, I've actually tried to accomplish that as well at the same time. So you mentioned people with deep pockets who may be interested. Well, I mean, it's actually difficult to provide that awareness in a legitimate and a non-threatening way.
Hmm.
I mean, because it just sounds like spam,
Sure.
really. And but there are individuals, and including, by the way, people with deep scientific curiosity, even if it's Bill Gates,
Hmm.
who may soon not have as much money, or could be Elon Musk or whomever. If they ever just get mildly interested in it, and if they view that there is legitimate work being done, then I would say that your suggestion would be the one method to bypass the universities and to bypass the corporate private labs and actually push to a solution. And it's perfectly clear why the corporate labs are not interested.
Hmm.
Because there's no money to be made in this.
Sure.
Yeah, there's nothing to be made here.
Yep.
And because, think about it. If we have to go door to door begging to get research funds for cancer, which affects like 30 to 40% of the population, how on earth are we going to get funding for a nuisance phenomenon that affects perhaps 3% of the population?
Yeah.
And so I'm very much in agreement with your suggestion regarding money. And no, it's not a bad thing.
Yeah, it would be excellent to see that happen. And so I guess I'm conscious of the amount of time you have. I do want to say so beyond the money and the awareness, do you think there's a tipping point, and where do you think it would be reached? It's been a while since I've done any Thomas Kuhn, a paradigm shift, but understanding that this exists, is it just that awareness? Is it something else? I'm sure in your mind you've even had fantasies of how this all of a sudden spools out and the road is laid clear, and you're able to just run with the project to its conclusion. But is there a paradigm shift that happens, and then what would you say you think the ending is? Do you think that there is an end point that's satisfying to people, and that would be satisfying to people who are legitimately suffering and people who just find it annoying?
I think, again, without aiming to be offensive,
Mhm.
I think that to a certain degree, I think to a certain degree that American society has taken a step backward in the last 20 years in terms of intellectual curiosity, belief in science and the scientific method, and has also drifted more towards superstition and the trumping of intuition and emotions over facts. In other words, I think the mountain has become taller in the sense of what has to happen. In other words, I think the background has changed.
Yeah.
Somewhat. And I come across that every day in the kind of emails I get and the sort of interactions I have with people. I would say that even if my own mind and in my teams, if we conclusively solve this, that is simply, well, it could even be less than half the struggle. I'll have to return to the metaphor of classic medical ailments. It is striking to me that serious physical illnesses that affect every single one of our families
Mhm.
are desperately underfunded
Mhm.
in terms of the research. And therefore, there is a possibility, number one, that my team and I will solve this, and it will simply become a footnote. And once my advocacy stops, for me, maybe I'll be compelled to, if for whatever reason my advocacy stops, and it simply this issue could fade into the background again.
Mhm.
Or again, there is a possibility that it's solved in a way where the solution to it could move into the mainstream medical repertoire. That's what I would really hope for.
Okay.
And there's be several other sort of what's the term they use? Is it orphan diseases, orphan syndromes, where that only affects smaller numbers of people, but nevertheless are still being actively studied. And occasionally we get pharmaceutical companies who will be motivated, in some cases only for tax write-off reasons, to go and to experiment with treatments to relieve people for this. I mean, because right now the only thing people have to relieve this issue at night is to turn on the bathroom fan. There's really not much more. So I'm not entirely optimistic that we're going to go to a full solution in a way that's going to improve people's lives, but I am extremely stubborn, and I am curious, and every once in a while I get reason to be optimistic about the directions of things, and every once in a while I'll get an email from somebody that says, "Thank you very much for your work, and please don't stop." And that's the kind of thing that would be the wind in my sails in that regard.
Keep going. I mean, I'm hoping that because of COVID and how much it's affected everybody's lives, that there's a greater desire for basic research and just discovery as a result of all of that. Was there anything we didn't cover in this that you think is important for people to know, or any last words on the subject?
Every time I'm interviewed on this topic, it goes in different directions, and I would say, with regard to this podcast, I would say that I think that so many everyday, serious, educated, responsible people, from doctors to lawyers to judges, so many people, either publicly or privately, have come forward and reported this, that we assume that this is real.
Mhm.
And if I could, I'll end with that rhetorical flourish that I use at least once in every single interview that I give. And you probably heard this before.
I might
So
have.
you probably know what's coming. Is I'll ask you the rhetorical question: do you believe people who report tinnitus? And the answer is yes. And then comes the important question: why do you believe them? And once we pause before we answer that question, and we look at the actual people and the reports of people who hear the world hum, we then move it to that matter-of-fact territory where these people are experiencing some sort of auditory phenomenon. Some of us are suffering from it, and it would advance medicine, it would advance science, and it would satisfy my curiosity if we could find the answer. Because I will quite honestly tell you, just to finish, that it still happens every once in a while, late at night, if I'm awake, and I'll hear that noise and I'll think, I wonder what that is.
Oh wow.
Seriously. I
Yeah.
wonder what that is. And so that's what drives it.
That's it. Well, thank you so much. Hey, I appreciate your time, and
That's it.
I appreciate what you're doing for just people worldwide. It's a real thing, really, just an amazing thing you're doing. And just please keep going. And you know, any way that this little podcast can help is great.
Let's touch base again in 6 months and see where it is.
Sounds good. Sounds
Okay.
good. Thank you,
Take
Dr.
care.
MacPherson. Bye now.
Okay. Take care. Bye.